Okay, we're almost there. Stefano, I didn't see you with the name, so otherwise I would have. Sorry, I didn't know about that. Good evening, Stefano. Would you like to open, please?
Go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so I would like to, on behalf of the director, I would like to welcome everybody on this guest lecture. We are very glad to have Professor Harlan Cohen with us. As usual, I would like to start with a couple of words about Professor Cohen, and then he will deliver his lecture, and then we will have a Q&A session as usual. I have to remind everybody that this class is going to be recorded, and so I hope everybody's happy with that. Of course, you can ask your questions, asking to open the mic and the camera. You can also write your question in the chat in case you don't want to. So again, let me start by saying that Professor Harlan Cohen holds a Gabriel Wilner UGA Foundation Professorship in International Law and serves as faculty co-director of the Law School of the Dean Rusk International Law Center. He was at the New York University School of Law as a Furman Fellow. He is currently a member of the Board of Editors of the American Journal of International Law and a member of the American Law Institute. He served as a member of the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law, and is also currently a chair of the American Society of International Law's International Legal Theory Interest Group. So in his scholarship and also in this teaching, Professor Cohen has focused on a number of interrelated areas, such as international law, international legal history, US foreign relations, global governance, international trade. So his scientific activities are very much in line with the areas of interest of the School of International Studies and with the activities that we do at the master and the PhD level. So we are honored to have Professor Cohen with us. He accepted our virtual invitation. As we said, hopefully he will be able to join us physically after another invitation in the future, as soon as everybody will be free to travel a bit more. Professor Cohen, you have the floor, 45 minutes, a bit less, a bit more according to what you need. If you would like to share the slide with us, please go ahead. And thank you again for accepting the invitation.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much. And first, let me just thank Professors Fracasso and Ali for inviting me. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you today. And thank you to all of you who are attending this evening in Italy or somewhere else. I'm really excited for the opportunity to engage with you on all of these ideas. If anything, I only wish I could be there in person. Hopefully at some point I'll be able. And just to get myself in the mood and perhaps provide a little bit of an incentive or reward for later, I actually pulled up one of my favorite wines from the region. So to kind of get myself in the mood of being in the Trento. We'll save that for later. So on to the lecture. So if you read the news, as I do, with interests in both economics or business and national security, the morning headlines that you read can really feel like you're reading a constant slew of metaphoric car crashes, right? We're seeing the spheres of the economic and the spheres of the national security sort of constantly crashing into one another. And in the aftermath of the collisions, right, we're left kind of confused as we look at the debris. We can't even figure out which broken pieces once belonged to one sphere or the other, right? We're in this confusing jumble that's being created by these constant collisions. Take TikTok, for example. What is it? How should we conceptualize it? Now, as someone under the age of someone over the age of 40, I have to say this question cuts a little bit close to the bone because I actually am not entirely sure what TikTok is. But assuming we all know what TikTok is, right, we might ask, is it a creative outlet? Is it a fun dance app? Is it an economic success story? Is it a competitive threat to Facebook, a cultural threat to some countries' cultures? Is it a data privacy disaster? Is it a Trojan horse for Chinese government spying? Now, policymakers worldwide seem a bit confused. If you were reading the news just last week, Pakistan banned TikTok because of the supposed spread of indecent content. Last summer, India banned TikTok over after clashes between Indian and Chinese forces in the Himalayas. And in the US, TikTok has been doubly banned, right? First under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a statute that gives the president the authority to ban certain kinds of transactions with US companies or freeze certain transactions in the US that's usually used against terrorist financiers. And then a second time by CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, a committee made up of top cabinet heads with power to both prevent foreign acquisitions, but also to unwind them. In this case, it ordered the Chinese parent company, ByteDance, to sell its US TikTok assets. All the while this is going on, of course, the viral videos continue, some even over the TikTok ban. Right. On the investment side of things, right, sorry, you might also be thinking, but the TikTok story is really one of just a large number of possible things we might talk about with regard to this trend about the collisions between economic and national security. One thing you might want to think about here would be the questions about Huawei, right, and the provision of 5G infrastructure technology, right? This is a question that's been particularly in the news in Italy, I know. But the question really is one of what to make of Huawei, right? Is it simply one company providing 5G infrastructure, perhaps more cheaply than others, that can then provide 5G technology to countries and their citizens? Or is it something that should be seen instead as a threat of state control of critical infrastructure, or potentially even a threat of espionage? As various states have tried to figure out what to do with this, whether to embrace or to ban Huawei, we've even been seeing that the story seems to be spreading in other directions. On the investment side of things, right, we're seeing more and more states expanding their scrutiny of foreign investments and acquisitions, again, citing national security as the basis for this. States are pretty much doing this everywhere. A good example here is FIRMA. This is the statute that's being applied by CFIUS, which has in the last couple of years expanded the scope of transactions that can be scrutinized or blocked in the United States. But really this trend of national security screening, this trend of expanding national security screening is really going on everywhere, right? It's pretty much taking place in every country at this point. And expansions of these statutes, expansions of the scope of what can be scrutinized are taking place in the European Union, Australia, China, and many other places. This trend only seems to be increasing with the spread of COVID-19 as states start to worry about the possibility of shortages of PPE, medicines, and vaccines. We're also seeing intensifying trade wars, right? States citing national security as justification for tariffs and other kinds of trade measures. This has actually led in the past few years to the first four disputes to ever reach the WTO, the World Trade Organization, dispute settlement system, or even the system under the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. These disputes before the WTO dispute settlement system include Russia's blockade of Ukraine. They also include the US's aluminum and steel tariffs adopted by the Trump administration, but which are still in effect right now under the Biden administration. They also include a case between Saudi Arabia and Qatar over Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates blockade of Qatar, including even claims that Saudi Arabia has been allowing the pirating of Qatar broadcasts of British football. And then most recently, we have the case between Japan and South Korea, which started with court cases in South Korea that raised questions about forced labor during World War II that seemed to have the apparent effect of leading to export restrictions in Japan, citing national security again, on various chemicals needed for the electronics industry in South Korea. This in turn has led to a boycott in South Korea of Japanese clothing manufacturer Uniqlo. Again, we're seeing kind of the blending here of all of these various different fields at the same time. And finally, even lab partnerships and educational exchanges, right, once seen as keys to global shared prosperity, have suddenly become suspect as potential vectors of either economic espionage or some other form of spying, with academics even being carted off to jail. All in all, altogether, as we look at this trend, right, people are trying to make some sense of this. And in an attempt to do so, various academics and other observers either dusting off or creating new terms, right? Either geoeconomics, right, this combination of geopolitics and economics, or things like weaponized interdependence, in an attempt to try to explain what to make or how to understand these various different trends. But the reality is that while these various terms, like geoeconomics or weaponized interdependence, are descriptive, right? They actually do a very good job of explaining, or at least describing what's going on. They don't do as good a job explaining to us what to make of this, right? How we should be thinking about these trends. Are these trends something new, right? Or simply a return to historical norms? Obviously, economics and security have always been intertwined, right? It's impossible to talk about military power without talking about the material power behind it, without talking about the economic needs to be able to manufacture or buy weapons. Perhaps the apparent trade peace of the past few decades was no more than a blip reflecting the particular power realities of a particular moment in history. Are these collisions, these trends that we're seeing, a reality that we simply need to accept or recognize, or are they instead something that we should be trying to avoid or slow, right? This is where these terms, I think, generally run out, right? They don't really tell us what normatively to make of this. Now, as lawyers, including myself here, our instinct is always to look to the law, to see if the law can help us to figure out how to manage these relationships. And in fact, both international and domestic law do provide us with various different rules that might provide tools in managing these relationships. So, for example, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, right, the primary treaty laying out the rules under the WTO, does have, as I mentioned before, a security exception. Right, this is Article 21. Right, and under Article 21, we find out that states are allowed to take certain kinds of action that they consider necessary for the protection of their essential security interests, particularly when taken in a time of war or other emergency in international relations. Right, if we look to investment agreements, right, here you have the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU, we will see a similar sort of provision providing some kind of exception where necessary for the protection of essential security interests. We can look at other agreements, the US-Argentina Bilateral Investment Treaty, one that is the source of a lot of litigation that some of you may know about, also has a similar kind of provision like this. Same thing with the Mexico-India Bilateral Investment Treaty. The Italy-Bahrain Bilateral Investment Treaty doesn't have a general exception clause like this, but it does suggest that where measures are taken for public security, right, they should not be deemed to be treatment less favorable under the treaty. Again, suggesting some room here for various kinds of exceptional treatment where you're talking about where you're talking about national security. Outside of international economic law, we might look to things like the UN Charter, which tells us that where there is a threat to international peace and security, the Security Council can, under those circumstances, order a complete or partial interruption of economic relations and of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communication. If we go to the law of armed conflict, right there, we will see various rules that will tell us when something that might ordinarily be an economic subject, say a factory, might become a military target. And we could look to other rules here too. We could look to the International Law Commission's articles of state responsibility and how they talk about necessity, right? As how that might be used in the national security context as an exception. We might also talk about the use of possibility of using countermeasures against various economic activities, right? All of these are going to be there within kind of the legal rules. Now, given all of these rules, it's perhaps unsurprising that much of the lawyerly focus has fallen on the WTO and its dispute settlement panels, which are the first international tribunals to consider these issues in this new geoeconomic era. Now, members of the WTO have long sought to avoid these sorts of disputes, right? Why? Right? And as I mentioned before, these are the first 4 disputes to ever reach dispute settlement there. Why? Well, it sets up a very unappealing choice for the panels, for the WTO generally. The scope of this provision, Article 21, on the one hand, is very, very broad, and it has a potentially self-judging nature in the words here of "it considers," which, if abused, right, could allow the national security exception to undermine the entire rules-based system. Right? In a sense, whatever the rules of the WTO might otherwise prevent, the security exception might suddenly allow. On the other hand, if panels or the WTO scrutinize these kinds of national security claims too much, they risk alienating members for whom the entire rules-based system is conditioned on the protection of core sovereign concerns like national security, right? The result is that given this choice, for a very long time, all members found that negotiating through national security claims rather than litigating them was much more appealing. They thought it was much more better to negotiate through them than to force the issue. Now, though, as mentioned before, not just 1, but 4 of these disputes have been before or are before these panels, 2 of which have already been decided. The first of these, the first of these is the Russia traffic and transit case, a case elegantly discussed by Professor Ali. In this case, the panel found an elegant way to thread the needle, right? They found on the one hand that there were things that could be reviewed in Russia's claim, but nonetheless found that Russia had met its burden of showing that there was a national security need. In a sense, Russia got its exception, but the WTO got some claim to authority over policing the guardrails. Now, for some, this resolution suggested the legal rules could manage all of this, right? That we could work through all of these collisions through rules like this. And the Saudi Arabia-Qatar case, right, the second case to be before these panels, followed the initial panel's lead in interpreting a similar provision of the WTO agreements. Whether or not that decision will be as successful is unclear. They partly found against Saudi Arabia, which meant that Saudi Arabia wasn't as willing to accept it, perhaps as Russia was to accept the decision in theirs. But the real question coming up for these various panels will be what to do in the US cases, which present a much more problematic situation, mostly because it is much harder to justify these claims as national security ones. Right? And in this particular case, even the US Secretary of Defense said that these particular tariffs were unnecessary. And this sets up the panels to either tell the United States that it can't do this, that national security choices are subject to WTO approval, something that would really risk escalating the current battle between the US and the WTO more broadly, potentially threatening kind of the role of the WTO as a whole, or the panels could roll over to the US, accepting the national security tariffs, which would then make a mockery of WTO review. Worse though, these cases are probably red herrings, right? They reflecting random policies of the moment. What's going to happen when the core cases, the cases at the core of today's policy issues, national security claims related to 5G, to data, and the environment come before these panels, things states and their constituents really care about? Will anyone accept the judgments of the WTO panels about what can or can't be done under these circumstances? I at least fear that judicial resolution at the WTO or elsewhere, no matter how elegant, no matter how well reasoned, is doomed to be unsatisfying. Why? Well, the problem is that hiding behind these technical terms are actually words steeped with deep normative judgment, words like necessary, words like essential, words like security, emergency, and peace, words that really can't simply be resolved in technical ways, words where the question isn't so much the technical ability of these arbitrators to reason out their meanings, but whether others, states, citizens, will defer to their views on these deeply normatively weighted words. The reality is that while international economic lawyers may be patting themselves on the back about decisions like the Russia-Ukraine one, breathing a sigh of relief at the way in which the panel was able to work its way through it, national security lawyers and policymakers have been less impressed. The reality, I would suggest, is actually a reality of two rooms, right? In one room, international economic lawyers and policymakers worry about protectionism and worry about security hawks. They argue about how to hold the line, disciplining these burgeoning national security claims. In the other, national security lawyers and policymakers wonder whether existing international economic rules, whether the GATT or these investment treaties give them the flexibility and protection they need. And they debate whether they should be just pushing the boundaries of these agreements, whether they need to reform these treaties, or whether they should be jettisoning the institutions like the WTO altogether. Now, for some time, these rooms were allowed to operate largely independently, confident in their rule over their domain. Over the past couple of decades, we have seen intermingling across these rooms, particularly as we started to mingle economic diplomacy. You can think about things here like loan agreements used in diplomatic ways, or the way in which increasingly targeted sanctions have operated against things like banks and banking that require expertise from finance ministries or treasury officials. But increasingly, I would suggest there's a sense in each of these rooms of invasion or occupation, a sense that they're losing turf to the other, that they need to defend what remains or to take something back. It's almost as if the people living in these two different rooms, the professionals in these two different rooms, live in alternate universes. And the resulting dissonance has only made the sense of disorientation that we feel with these collisions that much stronger. But it's the reality of these two rooms that I would suggest. It's the reality of these two rooms that helps explain why the current collisions are so difficult and confusing. Our ambivalence, right, that we're feeling, I would suggest, isn't over whether certain topics are matters of economics or national security, but much more deeply over the relationship between the two themselves. In one room, one set of professionals and their logic suggests that the logic of these agreements is it assumes that trade and economic relations are an overall good. Right? It's a model of peaceful exchange that security is meant to protect, not supplant. Right? In this room, right, for these professionals, security is like a rabid guard dog, best kept in its cage until it's absolutely needed. In the other room, with these professionals and the rules they promote, okay, sovereignty, the assumption is that security is a fundamental aspect of international relations. Right? Here in this room, trade and economics, they're tools to secure security itself. For those in this room, trade can no more supplant national security than a hammer could supplant the carpenter. But as we think about the logics of these two rooms and the logics they represent, we can see that these two parallel competing logics, they run much, much deeper than this. Right? So now I want to go through some deep sort of foundational principles. And I would suggest that these two rooms actually reflect a deep choice in how we organize individuals in society. At the heart, a question at the heart of philosophy is how the wills of different individuals should be aggregated or reconciled. We start, for example, from the liberal proposition that individuals and the individual will is a fundamental unit worthy of respect and protection, that each person has dignity, is a subject rather than an object of the law, whose choices are worthy of respect. How are we to balance the wills of the one against the wills of the other, right? How are we to actualize all of these potentially competing wills? Now, over time, we've come up with some imperfect answers. And I would suggest we actually have two kind of broad answers that we can fit various things into. Ones that in today's terms, we might describe as market or nation. Here you might think in terms of these two models of Hobbes and Smith, or you might think in terms of more modern, in a modern term, Rawls and Hayek, right? The idea here and these is that in the market, individual wills are going to be accommodated through consensual interactions and interpersonal relations. People are given the ability to find each other, develop relationships, and reach agreements. In the nation, on the other hand, individual wills are going to be accommodated through notions of group solidarity, and in some cases, through democratic decision-making. The common will is determined within and from the community. Now, we know that neither of these is a perfect solution. In markets, the poor risk domination by the rich. In the nation, the minority is subject to domination by the majority. Right? We know this, and thus we develop tools to help fight those problems. So we temper the market with fiduciary duties. We constrain the nation with notions of rights and due process. But we've also hedged our bets between the two, giving space to each one as a counterbalance to the other. We allow markets and nations to act in some ways as counterweights, right? So markets will rely on the laws and regulations of nations to guarantee against the worst forms of economic domination and to guarantee the continued functioning of the marketplace. Nations cede massive areas of policy space to markets, allowing individuals to vote through their interpersonal interactions rather than through group politics. And at the international level, the ambivalence between these two methods of organizing has led us to kind of rough division of labor across different fields or subjects or disciplines. Right? So in some, right, we lean heavily on the state, granting it primary authority, obligation, and space to achieve policy goals. In others, international law leans heavily on markets and international and interpersonal interactions. Thus, you could take, for example, one we haven't talked about here, human rights law. Right? Human rights law, despite its focus on individual rights, has largely left it to nations to hash out exactly how to apply these rules and to protect these rights. States are the ones who have the primary responsibility for protecting human rights, and national policymaking is given lots of room to figure out how best to balance the rights of those present. We can think about the limitation clauses in human rights treaties, doctrines like margins of appreciation. All of these are designed to make space to allow the nation as a community to make its decisions. In other words, the assumption in human rights is that individual wills should first be liquidated through the state. It's the nation that gets the first crack at balancing. Now, this model isn't uncontroverted or uncontroversial, right? There are lots of uncomfortable questions that are raised, for example, about the human rights obligations of transnational businesses that both highlight the state-centric nature of this regime, but also ways in which we might conceive of these obligations differently, might have them run in ways other than through the state. But in general, this is the model that current human rights law has settled on. Now, outside of that, over time, the exact mix of international law topics allocated to either nations or markets has shifted. Today, in most areas of international law, whether we're talking human rights, we're talking about security policy, immigration, or redistribution, it's states or nations who bear the primary responsibility and remain the primary locus of decision-making. Trade and investment laws stand out here as exceptions, in which decision-making, at least recently, has been left to the logic of markets. Right? In those fields, right, trade and investment, states are relegated to the margins. They retain supremacy over decisions deemed within their designated sphere, and state intervention is treated as exceptional, right? Literally, right? They're relegated principally to the exceptions clauses, are things like Article 20 and Article 21 of the GATT. Assigned to the logic of the market, trade and investment have come to idealize a model in which individuals express their will through exchange. Happiness and wealth is maximized for individuals by allowing them to choose what to buy and from whom. This kind of logic has no place for geographic borders. The market knows no boundaries, only relationships. And the state or the nation is viewed warily, right? Its force may be needed when the market and choice break down, when some individuals use their power to dominate others and stripped them of their choice or will, but allowed to roam unchecked, the state can subvert the market allowing some to undermine the choice of others through protectionism. So as a result, in these regimes, the national beast is kept in the cage, as I mentioned before. Letting it out requires a complex code to be entered, something like Article 21 of the GATT. Right. On the other side of the equation, we have security. Now, security need not be seen as a function of nations. Right? We have notions of human security that attempt to cast security in more interpersonal, transnational terms, and climate change, for example, has sometimes been cast as a matter of individual and collective transnational security rather than national security. But the national security claims that we're seeing, right, the ones we talked about at the beginning, they're not taking these forms. These are fundamentally claims of national security, claims to protect the prerogative of a particular people behind particular borders. And this, I would suggest, is revealing. As the type and scope of these various different national security claims has grown in the past few decades, to include aluminum and steel, cars, data, the environment, the instinct has been to try to find some way to limit what's in this box, to try to find some way to limit what can legitimately be described as national security and what cannot, usually using some notion of proximity to traditional military activities, right? This is at least part of what the panel in the Russia traffic and transit case tries to do. I think this misapprehends what's driving these claims. Any attempt, I would suggest, at making sense of national security claims must start by asking what is being secured. And fundamentally, what all these claims have in common is a claim to secure the nation. If we dig into the current national security claims, take something like artificial intelligence, for example, the actual threat can seem quite amorphous, speculative, projecting far into the future. It's hard to get a grasp on exactly what the threat is. Now, that doesn't make the threat any less real, but it does mean that the threat seems to boil down to concerns over national advantage or disadvantage, relative power or weakness. And in this sense, they aren't really different from traditional concerns about the relative dominance of, say, particular national industries. In other words, whether the claims are about traditional border defense, protection of data, worries about surveillance, industrial, or the protection of jobs, the fundamental claim made in invoking national security is that a particular political unit, the nation or the state, is threatened, that its wealth or power is under attack, that its ability to determine the rules that will govern and apply to its nationals warrants protection. Much as trade has come to represent arguments for organizing through markets, national security has come to represent claims that it is the nation and the security it provides that allows individuals to emerge from the state of nature and is the foundational building block of international society. Right? National security claims at their most fundamental level are claims about the value of nations and the right to protect nations' essential characters. When something is asserted as a threat, it is a claim to national prerogative and choice. To put it another way, national security claims not only embody arguments favoring organization through national solidarity, they encompass and represent all such arguments, right? So if trade symbolizes all arguments for organization through markets, national security symbolizes all such claims for organization through nations. Okay, so what does this mean for the trade security collisions that we've been talking about? So first and foremost, I would suggest that trade and security are miscast as subjects or topics to be balanced by tweaking legal rules. Instead, they are claims about who should be making the rules, for whom, and how. Right? Trade and security are best seen as separate competing paradigms whose very different logics are established and reified in specific competing legal regimes. The WTO and investment treaties on one side, the UN Charter and international humanitarian law on the other. Each is totalizing, elevating the logic of trade or national security over others, and defining the other as exceptional. Trade and security thus construct essentially parallel universes, with the various exceptions acting as glass doors between them. Some, like the GATT security exception, open from the trade side. Others, like the UN Charter, open from the security side. Each has its own door and its own code built into these legal principles. Now, from a legal standpoint, trade and security concerns might thus best be seen as, in legal pluralist terms, a situation in which two different bodies of law and their associated professionals seek to govern the same space. Each set of professionals will see the world and these disputes differently. Seen through the lens of international economic law, the test of any security measure is whether it can meet the standards of the treaties in question and their exceptions clauses. The question will be how much exceptional behavior by states the international economic law regime should tolerate. But seen through the eyes of national security and its professionals, the question will be how long to tolerate trade rules that impinge upon core state interests. Focus will fall less on the language of those economic law treaties. There'll be some efforts to fit it in, but more on international law's basic protections of sovereignty, on domestic law, national security statutes that turn off trade law effects, or on ultimately the option under international law of withdrawal. And our discomfort comes, I would suggest, in the fact that we recognize both of these worlds, right? We understand them, we understand their professionals. Oftentimes we are both those professionals. The problem is that we can't live in both these worlds at the same time, right? We're essentially forced to choose. We can't inhabit both these identities at once. So what do we do? So with such different logics in play, I would suggest that what we need to start to do is to think less in terms of resolving these economic and security disputes and more in terms of accommodating them, right? I would suggest that attempts to work out these disputes in whether it's in tribunals or elsewhere are at the end of the day going to be temporary settlements, not legal resolutions. For judges like our WTO panelists at the beginning, this reality puts them in a very difficult place. It means that deciding cases within the rules of either the trade universe or the security one, they're going to have to recognize the limits of their authority in that other room, in that other universe. Judges are going to be forced to choose between fidelity to their regime and judicial diplomacy with the other, right? We have some models we could use here to try to help these judges. We could look, for example, at the conflict of law rules of a model and imagine kind of these decisions less as resolutions than as messages from one regime to the other about what each one is willing to accept, what the guardrails are. We could see them as designed to clarify the desires and wants of these particular regimes. We could see dispute settlement here as being primarily designed as a forum for communication, where each side can clarify what it wants, what it can or can't accept, in the hopes of finding new accommodations. Judging becomes like maintaining in this model an armistice line, and tribunal decisions here are part of just a longer, larger ongoing negotiation. You might see each decision here as a proffer in a negotiation between spheres with the intent of reaching some new settlement. Had some settlement before, it's broken down. These are going to be an attempt to find a new one. Most importantly, though, seeing the security conflicts that we're seeing as a choice between nations and markets, I would suggest hints at when and why new conflicts are likely to arise. Sorry, I realize it's getting late, so I'll try to finish up here. As mentioned before, various legal regimes have settled around one or another choice, but there's nothing inherent about those choices. Our current regimes, their focus and their exceptions are all the result of an accommodation reflecting the wealth and power realities of a particular time. And changes in wealth and resource allocation between and within nations are likely to reopen debates among them. What that means is the coming battles over wealth distribution, over climate change policy, and over the regulation of data are likely to sound in the language of markets versus nation, of freedom versus threat, growth versus security, of everyone versus us, as we fight over decision-making authorities. Questions over global distribution of wealth have been the first to pop up during this period, advanced scouts in these conflicts. The global financial crisis put a spotlight on how wealth had and hadn't been distributed by the trade and investment regimes. It's easy to associate the US's aluminum and steel tariffs with the Trump administration, but populist politics, both left and right, have sought to dislodge the assumption that the mix of jobs is a question of markets rather than national policy. Tariffs and industrial policy are being talked about everywhere. And the rhetoric often starts with national security, but quickly shifts to the pandemic, to climate change, and most of all to jobs. The contours of this are going to be worked out over time, but what's going to be very hard to kind of disaggregate them because they all come down to the question of what should be questions of national policy as opposed to something else. But the ones at the forefront here, and this is where I'll try to end, are climate and data. With regard to climate, right, we're seeing questions about exactly who should be getting to make the difficult decisions about balancing all the priorities that are involved here. Right, the question is whether or not climate should be seen fundamentally as questions about national burden sharing, or whether they, as international problems best solved through transnational cooperation, or as interpersonal problems requiring individual solidarity across borders over resource consumption and sustainability. In other words, the question is going to be whether the paradigmatic response are national subsidies for solar panel production, environmental goods agreements liberalizing trade and green technologies, or personal commitments to veganism, reduced air travel, and the politics of sustainability or growth. Data presents a similar kind of problem. So what we're seeing with data is the possibility of massive shifts in how wealth and security are distributed between nations. And data ends up caught in a conceptual tug of war. Discussions about data toggle constantly between frames of personal privacy, competitiveness, crime control, national security, among others. And these frames bring with them competing policy prescriptions, national or regional, as in the GDPR, attempts at privacy protection, demands for data localization, trade agreements promising the free trade of data across supply chains, and or pressure for decoupling the technologies of potentially adversarial states. The extreme instability of these frames, I would suggest, comes down to our extreme ambivalence between markets and nation underlying all of them. Okay, so to conclude, I would suggest that recognizing the deep logic of nations versus markets underlying current tensions likely is not going to solve these problems. It's not going to provide us with satisfying answers. Sorry if that's what you came for. What I do hope it does is clarify the stakes and the deeper claims that need to be accommodated. Fundamentally, the question underlying all of this will be who will make the rules for the future. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cohen. Wonderful and very stimulating lecture. So I think that we can, there are some people uploading virtually. So I would invite everybody that is willing to ask a question to just write in the chat in order to book the question. I do have a number of questions, but I wait for the others to let me see. Okay, please don't refrain. In the meantime, perhaps I can ask a question, and then let's see. So I would like to start from the end clearly. And Professor Schiavo, the director, has also a question. So I don't know whether you would like to go first, Stefano, or very quick. In your presentation in the article, really at the end, you say that we should probably live with the ability to internalize the cost of national security claims rather than trying to adjudicate the claims. So perhaps we need to discuss a lot, but in order to let the politics then dominate in a sense. But to a certain extent, as an economist, I've always been told, and I teach students, perhaps wrongly, that the WTO and international agreements are tools to reduce uncertainty and to have what is the certainty of the agreements in a sense. So if everything remains up to the political decisions, in the end, there is no point in having the agreement because it's true that you can internalize whatever, but you never know what's going to happen. So my question is, are we doomed in a sense of not having far-reaching, deep agreement because of this national security reality that you described? Or to a certain extent, this can also be a limit to the extent to which national security can be called upon by the involved parties?
It's a great question, especially for anybody who is invested in the international economic law regime, right? So for those of us who study these things and care about these regimes, right, the fact that it does provide kind of certainty with regard to the rules, the fact that it creates a rule-based system is important, right? So it's hard to give that up, right? You don't want to say that that's something that we can just jettison. I would suggest, though, that the problem here is that in order for things like the WTO or investment treaties to provide certainty, right? They have to be built on some level of common agreement, right? So without that common agreement about what they're doing, they're going to provide only false certainty, right? So if the WTO panels basically answer these questions, but in ways that no one accepts outside of a group, a cadre of international economic lawyers or economists, they're not going to be effective in creating that certainty because states will then do something different, violate, or potentially withdraw, right? So I would say if we want things like the WTO to be able to provide that certainty into the future, we need to find some way to find a new accommodation that can reflect a new shared judgment about what the rules should or could be. And the only way to do that is to do it approach these questions with some degree of humility, right? So it means that we do need to bring politics back in, but we're bringing politics back in order to try to save the certainty that these kinds of institutions can provide long-term. If we exclude politics entirely, I fear we're doomed to have these things collapse.
Thank you very much. So I have a question, Professor Schiavo, Professor Ali. Stefano, the director that I unfortunately I didn't recognize with the name, so I couldn't ask him to join us at the beginning. I apologize.
It's my fault because I messed up with the accounts. I mean, I came in with the wrong account, so Andrea could not see me. Thanks a lot for accepting the invitation, of course, and also for the illuminating talk. Well, I have many questions, but I stick to two quick ones, hopefully. The first one is whether this collision between the two rooms or the two parallel worlds you have mentioned, you think this is here to stay, or is it just a one-off invention of Mr. Trump, which has been, I think, the main character in display in the last few years. So you think we have moved to a different sort of equilibrium, to a different, is it a structural change, or is it just a one-off blimp that in a few years will be forgotten? And the second issue is I would think that if we, let's say, the potential damage to the world order and this certainty sort of that Andrea was mentioning before, it's greater. The damage is greater when multilateral and international treaties are sort of put against, weighted against this national security issue, than when this is done with bilateral agreements. And the big example now is the renegotiation of Nafta, in which I think Canada and Mexico were sort of arm twisted into. But of course, I mean, it's a bilateral agreement. Something that you have signed 20 years ago might no longer be in your own interest now. So it seems that there is a greater degree of right to renegotiate, whereas for the multilateral agreement, it seems more flimsy. This idea. But this is just a very naive maybe way of approaching the issue.
Perfect. Thanks. Those are great questions. I think in terms of the first question, whether or not this is here to stay, I think it is. And I think, you know, we can talk about the trends outside of the United States too. All of you are probably more expert on how things are going in Europe as opposed to the United States. And I think that many of these trends are coming up there as well. So it's not just about Trump in those terms, but in the United States itself, if you follow kind of what's been happening since the Biden administration came in, it's clear that they are not moving in a wholly different direction, right? So they may be changing the rhetoric, right, to a certain extent, right? They are trying to lower the temperature on some of these topics. They may also not agree on some of the specific tactics being used. They may not agree, say, though they have not listed them on the aluminum and steel tariffs, for example. But if you look at the kind of policy prescriptions they're putting out, right, and the statements being made by new officials in their nomination hearings, it's clear that they see many of these questions as ones that need to be taken back from the realm of the GATT and markets and back into the area of national policy making. So you see there's actually a massive administration-wide project that they're about to undergo, specifically looking at supply chains. And if you look at the breadth of what they're looking at, I mean, they're looking at every possible issue here, from questions with regard to climate change to questions with regard to jobs, right? So everything is on the table. And that seems to be kind of where they're going. And it seems like where they're going with things like the WTO as well. So I think these questions are very much here to stay. I also would suggest, as I suggested at the end there, that on questions like data, which haven't gotten as much prominence under the Trump administration, right? These questions have been lurking for a while and are going to continue because we still haven't come to terms with how to even conceptualize what data is for these purposes. So a lot of different ideas about how to categorize it are in play. So I think those will continue for some time, though. I do hope that a new accommodation will be reached as people start to figure out what to make of these new realities, right? These things are relatively new, but in a decade, maybe we'll have found some kind of new accommodation. In terms of the bilateral versus the multilateral, I fear that the bilateral becomes a way to undermine the multilateral, right? So in a sense, this was actually what the Trump administration, particularly the then US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, wanted, right? In the sense, you can make deals with Mexico and Canada on NAFTA that reflect already shifting sands on things like jobs and data, also on kind of the questions about the protections for investment. You could make separate deals with South Korea. You could make separate deals with China, right? In ways that you couldn't in the multilateral framework of the WTO. And in many ways, they kind of drove negotiations of WTO to a standstill, right, in their opposition to things like the appellate body. So rather than it being that something that can be worked out bilaterally, I worry that it's something where the bilateral becomes a way to undermine kind of the global. So it's easier to work out, not because it's a good place to work it out, but it's easier to work out because you are taking things off the table from everyone else. So.
Thank you very much. So we have a number of questions, one by Professor Ali, Diego, in Georgia. So perhaps, I don't know, Professor Ali, Nino, do you have one or two questions? Or
Just one
please
question.
go ahead. Okay, then maybe we collect two questions if you like, and we go two and two.
Okay.
Is that okay?
So thank you very much for this very stimulating speech. And I will try to put things very, let's put it in this way, very simple. Basically, we had no collision between, let's say, commerce and national security for so long, okay? Just few cases in the whole history of GATS WTO. Then at some point, something changed, okay? Well, basically, we had three big fields in which we had cases, so Ukraine, Qatar, of course, United States and the rest of the world. But I think that until the fall of the Berlin Wall, the concept of security was mainly focused on this idea of political and military security. So the real existence of the state. If you have a nuclear war, I mean, the real issue is the existence of the state. And then at some point, I mean, we started to see that maybe this nuclear war was not was not really an option. And I mean, because of some political decisions that were made. But the point is, then in the last 10 years, 15, we started to see all the national strategies of states like, for example, UK. In 2015, Cameron, the former prime minister of the UK, started the national security strategy in this way. And I have the text in front of me. So our national security depends on our economic security. Then, if you have a look at the last document of the national security of the United States 2020 or all the others of the last 10 years, the second pillar is security, is economic security. And well, it's hidden under a word which is prosperity. They use always the same word, prosperity, prosperity, prosperity. It's the same in the UK, in the United States, and other countries. So I think that the real issue is that today, under the national security clause, it is included also the exigence of an economic security, of protecting economic security, and so the economy of the state. And so reconciling this is the big issue, because states started to use intelligence power even in the fields of economic security. This is the issue. The issue is that this enlarged idea of national security is causing this raise of walls, for example, in international trade and in investments, in the field of mergers control, and the field in so many different. So, what's your idea about this phenomenon of enlarging this idea of national security? Thank you.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I would say that my diagnosis, at least, which I think is similar to what you're suggesting, is that what you're seeing is two things happening at the same time. So one, this goes back to what you mentioned about the Berlin Wall, is you're seeing kind of a true rise of multipolarity for the first time since World War II, right? So, here we could talk about the end of kind of the bilateral fight between the Soviet Union and the United States, represented by the Berlin Wall, but you could also be talking about the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of a lot of other states to positions where they at least have the authority or the ability to go out on their own more and make their own deals, right? So you're seeing power dispersed in very different ways from the way in which it was before, both in terms of challenges and opportunities. The other thing that's changing at the same time is the changing nature of the weaponry. So this comes back to what you're saying about nuclear weapons. If not weaponry, we could be talking about the changing sort of resources that lead to state power, right? Where we have things on the table that we never had before. I think this is where data and AI play such a large role now, right? There's a sense that in this multipolar world where everyone is now jockeying for position, right? Power is not going to be determined by how large or traditional military is, but may be determined by your control over data, your control over growing fields of artificial intelligence. What that's doing is it's creating that anxiety that we don't know what national security means, right, in this new world. But we thought we knew, but now with all of this competition, right, which we're grasping to try to figure out what might count. And I think this is the new reality that we essentially have to deal with, right? That the old rules were built on relatively stable understandings about both of those things, right? Where power lay and what constituted power. Those things are now in question, and they're gonna undermine these things until we can find some way to create rules for them, whether that's specific rules with regard to some of these subjects like data, or whether it's ways of accommodating them.
Thank you. If I may say, for the economic profession, is the collapse of the win-win situation. No, there's no win-win anymore, and then you fight over who wins. So there was a question by Diego Dominici, and Georgia wrote a question on the chat. I don't know whether she wants to ask the question directly or I can read it. But Diego, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering if I could ask a question about, do you think that maybe the European Union, because of its, let's say, structural makeup, would be capable of having an easier time resolving these difficulties in between its member states? And if so, could it maybe sort of provide a model that could be followed at a more international level? Or do you think that it's not really something that can be resolved at the supranational level, and the states or the various judicial elements need to be figured out irrespective of that? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I might want to turn it back over to all of you, since you'll have a better understanding of kind of the micro politics of Europe. I mean, I think that at some level, to the extent it always comes back down to questions of solidarity, right? So to the extent to which groups of states feel like they are together on issues, they share concerns, it's going to be easier for them to work out these kinds of issues. To the extent to which they don't feel that common solidarity, right, they're going to be in a more competitive position and be more worried about gains to one or gains to the other. I think, at least as the outside observer, Europe has proven a complicated mix of solidarity and competition over the last few years. So I think it'll be interesting to watch to see if they can retain that solidarity on some of these issues over time. But it's hard to say, right? I mean, part of the problem here is that each of these issues that we're talking about here, it's overturning expectations about who has power and control, both outside of Europe and inside of Europe. And that's going to put pressure on things like solidarity. But I'd love to hear anybody else's thoughts on how things are going.
Thank you. So I don't know whether Georgia wants me to read the question in case.
Good evening. Good evening. Okay, sorry, I thought that Professor Fracasso would have read my question, but sorry.
If you prefer, so as you like.
No, it's the same. It's the same.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture. It was truly interesting. My question is focused on the part that you mentioned, that you talk about the link between trade, nations, and human rights. And in my point of view, and I'm thinking about my exam of economics, I'm trying to figure out which is the role of labor rights in this panorama. I mean, if I think about supply chains or this kind of stuff, there is a clear link, in my point of view, between trade, the role of politics, and the role of human rights, as you said. But which is, your opinion, the link and the power of this reasoning, if I can declare it as a proper reasoning? Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great question, because I mean, it shows how a lot of these different regimes are kind of simultaneously in some level of flux. And with regard to labor, I mean, I think if you look at what's happening in the actual negotiation of these international economic agreements, you kind of see how there's a bit of a tug of war going on over how to define labor rights. Are they primarily about protecting one state's labor force from kind of the dangers of free trade, right, of undermining them? Or is it about guaranteeing kind of the human rights of laborers everywhere? And what I think you're seeing is that there has been, at least for a little while, some rough alliance between developed state labor forces who want to protect their own workforces and human rights advocates who want to protect labor generally, which has led to some of these provisions in these various agreements that are meant to protect labor. If you look at them closely, they kind of it's hard to figure out exactly what they're doing. So if you take USMCA as an example here, right, requiring a certain minimum wage for auto parts workers, it's clearly on one level designed to protect US auto parts workers. At another level, though, you could say, and there are some who said that this is actually a tool to help raise the minimum wage in Mexico that the prior agreement never provided, right? It never provided any mechanism for laborers there to raise their standards. And you could say similar things about some of these provisions that ended up in CPTPP, right, that are meant to protect labor, right? It's unclear which they're doing, but there is some kind of rough alliance there. The interesting thing here is, who are they against? So this alliance is in some ways against developing states who feel like these are essentially being used as ways to protect developed state economies at their expense. So again, you're seeing how everyone's trying to figure out how to capture the framing to try to kind of make sure that their interests are best served here. But I think it's a really interesting area to focus more on.
Thank you. So there were Professor Pertile, Marco, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you very much. It made me think of a number of issues, and perhaps the main doubt I have is whether you think this dichotomy should be rediscussed, the dichotomy nations and markets should be rediscussed in the light of so many states in which the chain of political legitimacy is broken or not functioning properly. So the doubt was whether this security exception is actually being invoked on behalf of the nation or on behalf of groups of individuals within the nation, specific interest within the nation, being to some extent shielded by the security exception, by the security discourse. So I was wondering whether you think the dichotomy actually holds, or whether we should rediscuss the dichotomy, or for how many states is the dichotomy applicable, nations and markets?
It's a good question, and I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest that every state making claims about national security is actually looking out for its people and doing so. We clearly know that's not necessarily the case. I do think that there is rhetorical truth to the way in which national security claims are being made, even in corrupt or authoritarian places, right? So even in those places, the way in which national security is being invoked, it's often invoked with all the other symbols of nationalism as sort of an argument for why that particular state is under threat somehow from either those internally who might be cavorting with those externally, or by others outside. So I think that at least in terms of sort of explaining the rhetoric and the appeal of that rhetoric, right? So the reason why that rhetoric is being used, I think it holds. But it may very well be that it's only at that level and doesn't actually flow deeper than that.
Thank you. Joachim?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the lecture. So I have a question basically about the fact that many powerful countries, especially the US, have increasingly developed far-reaching laws and norms, which are often extraterritorial in domains which were supposed to be regulated by international conventions, or at least seen as part of global governance. So I'm here thinking about domains like armed trade with American norm ITAR, corruption with the American FCPA or the UK Bribery Act, or even data with the European GDPR and the American Cloud Act. So I mean, these laws are not necessarily justified explicitly by the argument of national security, but clearly they aim at implementing a sort of new regulation of global issues which favors national interests of the country which create them. So how do you think the development of these sort of extraterritorial laws will unfold in the future? What can be their consequence for the global order, and how sustainable this trend is, basically?
Well, thanks. I mean, it's a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure of the answer to it. It's an interesting thing to kind of try to think through. I think, at one level, it goes back to Professor Picasso's initial question about kind of the undermining of predictability in a rules-based order, right? These unilateral sort of extraterritorial assertions of authority are working against the idea of multilateral rulemaking and multilateral decision-making. But at the same time, it's hard to categorize them exactly in these terms, because unilateralism may not always be, unilateralism can sometimes be pro-social, right? What do I mean? Sometimes these rules can be ways to kind of work towards a broader goal that, and it may be useful to have sort of one state kind of pushing in that direction. So people have different views about these rules, but if you think about the FCPA, one might say that the U.S. took the lead, perhaps in a unilateral way that wasn't necessarily friendly on some of these bribery issues, but others have followed suit, and you've actually had multilateral arrangements arise from it. You could say the same thing about the kinds of privacy rules in something like GDPR, where you now see kind of, while some might not have been happy about it outside of Europe initially, others, like say California, are seeing it as a template, as a model to potentially work off. So it's hard to know exactly where to put these, right? Because it may not be that these fall onto the same nations versus markets axis. They may be a different axis in their own right with regard to unilateralism versus multilateralism, but it is interesting to think about what's playing into that, what interests are actually playing out in the choices of where to make these decisions. But I'd have to think about it more, so I appreciate the push.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is another question by Professor Massetti. Emanuele, please.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. And thank you for your presentation, Professor Cohen. I'd like to hear your view on a couple of thoughts that popped into my mind while I was listening to your presentation. The first thought is that from your presentation, it seems that we are sort of sliding towards a new Cold War. There is an erosion of trust in international trade, in international economic relations, and this erosion of trust among states might signal a move, at least, towards a possible start of a new Cold War. However, in the multipolar world that we are living, it's not clear who is against whom in this would-be hypothetical Cold War. But from the point of view of the ideological struggle, it seems to me that the very fact that there is this erosion of trust and this pushing back of politics towards law and international agreements signal a sort of repudiation of the free market ideology. The fact that nations are coming back is in itself a defeat of market fundamentalism in a way. And I would like to hear your view on this. And the other thought was that if you see as a paradox the fact that this is linked to what Antonioli was saying, that economic security is linked to prosperity. And I was thinking whether it could be seen as a paradox, the fact that economic security is pushed primarily by, in the Western world at least, by Anglo-Saxon countries, which are the ones that have been most capable to recover from the recent economic crisis. And it's not proposed by the European Union, for instance, which has lost quite a lot of its prosperity in the last decade, and it's proving very unfit for recovering from the crisis. Do you see this as a paradox?
That's a really interesting question. And just to take the last one first, my tendency is to think that what's going on here is that, as I said before, some of this is about the shifting nature of power here and who is in power. And in some ways, in the Anglo-American anxiety here, right, they're the ones who perhaps feel the loss of power most, whether it's actually truly a loss of power. They're feeling the loss of power relative to others the most, and that's why you get this. The interesting thing for the European Union, right, and again, all of you are more expert in this than I, is why it would fall outside of this category. And it might be that in pushing comparative advantages here in world politics, the EU sees itself as having a comparative advantage in pushing the rules-based multilateral system. So that its power is associated in some way with these rules, right? So its interest is actually in kind of pushing for them, even as I would agree, the faith and kind of market fundamentalism is shifting. Going to that, right? I think that does seem to be the case. But one way to think about that is that the market fundamentalism that existed was in many ways the protection of certain powerful interests at a particular time, right? So if we look at who was pushing back on market fundamentalism in earlier periods, if you look at something like the new international economic order, right, it was developing states pushing against this because they recognized that market fundamentalism was a way of empowering former colonial powers and developed states. Now things have shifted. So those who were once pushing market fundamentalism see the ways in which it doesn't necessarily serve their interests. So I think you are seeing those shifts in at least ideological bedfellows, right? So people are shifting the alliances in terms of ideology there. In terms of the first part you raised about kind of the potential for a Cold War here by kind of shifting to politics. So I'm very concerned about the Cold War analogies that are being thrown around, particularly in the United States. I actually think it's really unhelpful. And the more you call it a Cold War, the more you'll get a Cold War. So, I mean, it very much worries me that that's becoming somewhat dominant. What I would suggest, though, is that the way you get a Cold War is by allowing all of these various different concerns that are out there to be lumped into one whole. right? To not disaggregate the different issues that people are having with one another, and to start to think about these as kind of broader omnibus concerns between different states. What I would hope you would want to do, given what we're recognizing here, is to start to disaggregate the concerns, to force states to be clearer about exactly what it is that worries them about Huawei, about exactly what it is that worries them about artificial intelligence, about exactly what it is that they see as the best solutions going forward with regard to climate. There are ways to use these bodies like the WTO to help sort of clarify those things. So thinking more in terms of committees where people are forced to share information and tribunals where they resolve disputes. But I think that's the way to avoid a Cold War, is to kind of force greater clarity, to force states to actually be clear about what it is that they're arguing and what it is that they want or are afraid of.
Thank you. There is another question by Sondra Faccio, my colleague.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation, Professor Cohen. I have a question concerning your statement. You invited to think less in terms of resolving disputes between security and economic interests, and think more to settle such disputes, suggesting that perhaps the existing investment arbitration system is not any more useful tool. So I'm asking, what other instruments do you see to resolve or settle, or whatever word you want to use, these disputes? And how do you see the negotiations are currently ongoing within the United Nations concerning a multilateral court? And also you mentioned, if I heard properly, conflict of laws models. So I was curious to understand how to apply conflict of laws to this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, those are great questions. So I think that in terms of thinking about how to accommodate or sort of get settlement here rather than judgment, right? You don't necessarily need to move beyond tribunals, right? But you may need to be able to move in a different direction in terms of what tribunals are doing, such as an initial sort of set things out, right? So it may very well be that what you need here are rules from these various tribunals that create political space, right? That lay out clear guardrails, rather than sort of saying this is in or this is out, right? So that you're basically creating kind of a forum for kind of constant communication. Maybe you create rules or standards that require certain kinds of articulations of threats, right, at the outset, that might then be deferred to if they're properly articulated, right, as a way to kind of share information and reach some kind of settlement. But you might also be thinking, as I was just mentioning, about moving more to things like committees, where the idea would be that, you see this with some of the other parts of the WTO, that so long as you play ball, right, you come forward with the reasons for why you're adopting a particular measure, you're clear about what it is, there may be some deference to you in having done it, right? So it creates kind of a trade-off between information sharing, clarity, right, transparency, and being recognized, right, which may allow everyone to kind of be able to work together more towards some kind of solution. In terms of the investment regime, it's complicated because I'm not sure this is the main thing that is driving those concerns. So at some level, it definitely is about nations versus markets, right? So there is a sense, right, that the kind of Washington consensus model of kind of neoliberalism that was underlying some of these agreements, right, that no longer holds sway with many of these states who want to protect their public policy, right? But it's not the tribunals per se that's the issue there. It's the rules those tribunals apply in some sense. So it might help to move things away from the commercial arbitrator model, right? Because those are seen as being too market friendly, to moving towards judges who may have more of an appreciation of national policymaking as something like a multilateral court. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that it will work if the rules themselves aren't, if they aren't reformed as well. So you need both reform of the where and reform of the what. So you've got to create both kind of the respect for policymaking by states, as well as the room for state policymaking. But obviously, there's a lot more we could say about I'm aware of time, so there's a lot more we could say about the investment regime.
So I can't resist. So let me, the last. I have a number of things going around in my mind, clearly confused, but there is one thing that came up during the discussion. Professor Ali was talking about what did it change over time that led to this clear shift in paradigms? Okay, we have mentioned the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall. We mentioned probably China. It is very important to understand issues with steel and these kind of trade issues. But on the other hand, I think that one important thing is, as you mentioned several times, is data, is the IE, these are technologies and industries where the first one gets at the top, remains at the top, the winner-take-all kind of industries. And there you cannot have a win-win situation. So the thing that is puzzling me is that all those that are not at the top should not like to go in that direction, because once you use security issues in order to preserve the your advantage, then the others remain there. So I understand from a US point of view or Chinese point of view, sometimes European, but not very often, why one would like to go that way. But the others should resist in their own interest, national interest. So could you help me out to clarify this tension?
Well, I'm happy to try to help, but whether or not I can get to the bottom of what's going on with sort of pressures on data, I doubt. But I think that the issue is, right, that data remains very difficult to conceptualize in terms of what it is in terms of power or competition, right? So if we think about data, as I think you were just suggesting about kind of who is going to be at the top of kind of a market in data or AI, right? Well, then we have a model where we're thinking about it in terms of competitiveness, and where everybody who isn't the US and China is going to feel very left out of these US-China conversations. But that's not the only thing floating around there as the way we should be conceptualizing this, right? Obviously, one major conceptualization of data is really about privacy, right? That the issue here is not about competitiveness, it's about protecting individuals' rights, right? And there, if you think that's the primary concern, right, you're going to think about this differently than you would if you were thinking about this in competitiveness. The same thing goes where if you think this is primarily about national security and surveillance, right? So if you think this is not about competitiveness, but about surveillance, right, then you're going to be eager to get into this game regardless, and perhaps protect yourself against these big players, regardless of whether that leaves you at a disadvantage competitively, because you see that as the primary thing you have to protect yourself against. And then finally, there are versions here where it's seen primarily as property, where the concern here is, for example, you see this being floated in places like India or Brazil, that developed countries are basically taking the property, they're mining the data of developing countries for their own good. They want to take that property back by taxing it in some form or something like that, until we work out how to conceptualize it, or at least disaggregate it so we can conceptualize different aspects in different ways. I think you're going to see a lot of policy flux.
It's a lot of work to do, so that for us. Okay, I thank you very much. We'll be thinking about all these issues for a long time. I would like perhaps to ask Professor Schiavo, the director, to close for us, but let me thank you very much for this interesting talk and discussion. Stefano, please.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks first of all to you for proposing the invitation and for asking Harlan to give a talk. It was a very nice. It's one way. I think we have to come together to common issues from different disciplinary point of view. Here there are, at the school there are economists, lawyers, there are political scientists, and there are sociologists, historians, and we try to indeed find some common ground and common keywords and common questions that are useful. I think it was a great way to do this tonight with you. Thank you very much. I really hope there will be further occasions to interact and possibly in person once all this mess is over. Maybe I look forward to seeing you for a longer period, maybe with a visiting position for a few weeks, for a month or so in the near future. And there will be a great possibility for us to move forward on these topics and discuss again, maybe even more these topics. So thanks a lot for accepting our invitation and for your talk.
Well, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk with all of you. And I really deeply appreciate the deep engagement that all of you have brought to this. I hope you could tell I don't think of this as a set of solutions. I see this as a set of questions. But I'm struggling with this as much as any of you are. I would love to continue to struggle with it through this with all of you in the future, right? I hope we can engage more with each and every one of you. And of course, if the opportunity presents itself to come there in person, I would love to be able to join you there too. So thank you to all of you for joining me this evening.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This
Enjoy
is also
the wine.
recorded.
After class.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening, everybody, and have a nice day in the US.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.